So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on how to use psychology on B2B marketing for more impact. So my name is Chili. I'm going to be your host today. I'm Managing Director at Passion Digital. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a performance marketing agency with a passion for search. We put together strategies and run all sorts of digital performance campaigns for our clients, from Google Ads to SEO, content marketing, paid social, you name it. A good chunk of our current client base is B2B companies of all sizes, and we're always testing new ways of making our campaigns, our copy, our ads more effective. And that's why we wanted to host this super interesting session today with our friends at Capuchin, Behavioural Science, which I'll let them introduce themselves and the topic in a minute. Just before we continue, very quick housekeeping. So this session is set to run for maximum 1 hour. We'll let you out at 2 o'clock, if not earlier, but we've allowed for some time for Q&A. If you have questions that you want the guys to answer, you can use the Q&A and the chat capability, and then we'll go through them afterwards. If you need to leave, don't worry, we're recording the webinar and we'll send it over after it's done. So yeah, very excited about starting this and hearing what the guys at Capuchin has to say. So without further ado, Dan, Patrick, all over to you.
Thank you. Hi, Patrick, are you okay to put the slides up?
Absolutely.
So good afternoon. I'm Dan, one of the co-founders at Capuchin Behavioural Science. I thought we'd start with an experiment. So in this test, respondents were introduced to the researcher who shook their hand and told them the test would begin in a minute. Actually, the test had already begun, and it's what happens when you shake somebody's hand. And as you'll see here, people have a tendency to touch their head, their face, and particularly their nose. So I was just wondering, why do you think that is? Maybe we could have a bit of a test of the Q&A. You could drop any ideas that you might have into the Q&A. Why would it be that people would touch their nose after they've had their hand shaken? Any ideas? Well, I'll tell you, and maybe we just go on to the next chart, Patrick. Everybody does this. Fabian, yes, absolutely, bang on. It's a little bit gross, so I ought to apologize a little bit in advance, but luckily we haven't met face to face and actually shaken hands. It is that people are actually smelling their hands, and the reason for this, I warn you, it's a little bit gross, is when you shake hands, there is a transference of sweat. Sweat contains pheromones, and from pheromones we can detect, is this person, would they be a good mate, they're part of our tribe, are they healthy? And everybody does this. Now, the thing is, now I've pointed this out, you may be a little bit paranoid if we meet, please don't. You might spot other people doing it when you're concentrating, and you might see if you do it yourselves. But I can guarantee you that when you're even the slightest bit distracted, and as you'll see, it doesn't take much to distract the conscious mind, you too will be doing this as well. And so that's what we do as a business. We show our clients how to use the psychology of the human brain to drive hard commercial results. Do you mind popping on to the next chart, Patrick? Thank you. So what that means in practicality is we use psychology and data to show what our audiences really think and how do you predict and change their behavior. That usually manifests itself as one of three things. Firstly, showing new opportunities based on how decisions are actually made and how you can influence those, or quantifying opportunities based on psychology in the marketplace or within player bases. And the second part is how you make what you offer more persuasive based on the mental processes that are actually going on. That might be product. We do a lot of price psychology or messaging and images to make them more persuasive. And then the last piece is how you actually change behavior. And You may have heard the phrase nudges. Nudges have a bit of a misnomer, almost like every nudge works on every individual, but that's not necessarily true, as we'll show you a little bit later. What we do is produce bespoke nudges to identified psychological traits that our clients can then use to change behavior, whether that's online, offline, or increasingly a combination of the two. We've done quite a bit in B2B. We've used psychology and data to answer quite a few questions, such as how can you target and persuade different psychological groups to buy business financial services? How can you persuade different SMEs to buy technology products? How can you persuade senior decision makers in large enterprises according to their own psychological and their broader organizational traits? And how can you use price psychology to make products more appealing to business audiences? How do you apply behavioral science to convince businesses to sell complex intermediated products? Or how do you target and persuade marketers according to their own psychological makeup? How can you influence expert decision makers? The psychology of frontline retail teams and how you influence them? The dynamics to build and repair trust between businesses and brands? Even how can you predict if somebody will succeed in professional training? If you like what you hear today, there's a lot more of this on our blog, from nudges, psychological profiling, attention, psychology of money, and plenty of other things, so do have a look. But the main thing we wanted to do today was give you a bit of a view under the bonnet of how the human brain works and how you can practically apply that in the B2B context. So I'll hand over to Patrick, who'll take you through that.
Thank you, Dan. Hi, everyone. Please allow me to introduce myself quickly. Hello, I'm Patrick. Sometimes I ask people to call me Pat. Please don't do that, though, just between us. I hate it. But the reason I say that is, as this study shows, people who use a shorter name or a nickname are seen as more cheerful, which I think is where I could use some help, as you can probably tell. And so that's the kind of thing we do at Capuchin, is take the academic or science side of psychology, which can be a bit intangible, a bit vague sometimes, but think about how to actually practically use that in the real world, like optimizing your own name, but obviously more practically websites, branding strategies, apps, and so on. I'm also doing something else at the minute to influence your perceptions of me, hopefully for the better. Any guesses in the chat what that might be? Feel free to be rude. Blurring my background, I suppose so. I suppose so. In a way, actually, there was a study that found that a blurred background is seen as more professional than a normal home one. Standing up, no, that's just because I have a stoop and it's causing me pain, so I need to stand up more. Telling something funny about yourself, well, I suppose I am doing that to influence your perceptions, but more it's just to mask some very deep insecurities. Camera and glasses. Yes, glasses. It's my glasses. So well done if you spotted it, and also I'm very close to the camera. Oh. Yeah, hopefully smell is the answer to the previous question. Hopefully. But no, a couple of people spotted it, glasses. So if you spotted it, well done. And also if you're wearing glasses, well done. People who wear glasses are at least perceived as more intelligent, hardworking, and honest. I'm possibly none of those things. I don't need glasses. These are actually 99p from eBay. They ironically make it harder to see. So I'm going to take those off now. But another example of how what might seem very minor or subtle things in the environment can, in theory, have a big impact on perceptions and behavior. Now, we can be more kind of practical and useful with this, of course. For example, McDonald's, if you've been to McDonald's recently and ordered food from their digital kiosks in the restaurant, you may have noticed that they put Coke Zero at the top of the soft drinks list because in a pilot study, they found in 12 weeks across selected stores, they changed people's behavior so much with this that they removed 25 million calories from people's diets because it uses what's called the order effect, or similarly the default effect, where we just tend to go with the status quo, we go with the easiest thing, we tend to anchor to the first option we see, and we're more likely to pick that, which of course Google knows to great effect. So there's this McDonald's example. There's also, of course, the example of auto-enrollment pensions in the UK, where changing pensions from opt-out to opt-in made people more likely to have a pension because we're more likely to go with the easiest thing, with the default, the recommended thing. Likewise with organ donations, countries where it's opt-out rather than opt-in have a much higher rate of organ donation. And so the reason this happens is because all of us are what's known as cognitive misers. So we have very, very limited brain power for paying attention to the world and processing information and making decisions. Now, you can't put a number on something like this because conscious and non-conscious systems are very much intertwined, but some people have tried. One researcher found that there are 11 million sensory neurons firing in the brain every second, but only 40 of these go through conscious pathways. So by his guess, we're only consciously aware of 0.0004% of the world around us. So we can only pay attention to a tiny slice of it. At the minute, you're paying attention to me, hopefully, and not to the humming of your computer. But now you are, because I pointed it out. So we can only consciously attend to a tiny slice of everything that's around us. A nice study here illustrating just how limited the conscious mind can be. Participants were asked to memorize a number. Half of them were given a 2-digit number, quite easy to do. And the other half were given a 7-digit number, which is more taxing. That's actually about the maximum amount of information you can hold in your head at any one time. It's called the magic number 7. That's why if you get a one-time password from a bank, for example, it's 6 digits long, because you won't remember more than that. So anyway, while they're memorizing the number, they could choose a snack. They could choose either cake or fruit. Now, under the normal-ish conditions of the 2-digit number, most people chose the fruit. Whereas under the more taxing conditions of the 7-digit number, most people chose the cake. Because which of these two snacks is the more rational one to choose? It's the fruit, for a couple of reasons. First of all, you have to inhibit that kind of monkey brain emotional impulse to eat as many calories as you can and have the cake. So that it takes effort on the part of the conscious mind to suppress that emotional impulse. And secondly, fruit is something that you kind of need to think about the future. You need to think in more abstract terms. You need to engage that conscious mind a bit, which again is more effortful. So it takes more effort and energy to choose the rational snack, the fruit. And all it took was a 7-digit number to kind of max out working memory, to max out that conscious thinking and allow the impulsive emotional brain to take over. So we're not dealing with a huge amount of brain power. Another useful, if slightly old theory is the triune brain theory, which suggests there are 3 rough parts to the brain that developed over time, and with these parts developed specific functions. So the evolutionarily oldest part of the brain, the so-called reptilian brain, is responsible for things like reflexes and heart rate and so on. In the middle there, you have the so-called mammalian brain, responsible for things like emotion. And around the outside, you have the so-called human brain, responsible for advanced things like planning ahead, language, taking other people's perspectives, etc. Now, as I said, it is an outdated model a bit, is a bit simplified, but recent brain imaging research generally supports that these parts of the brain do these functions. And from an evolutionary point of view, it's useful because it tells us that the older parts of the brain have ensured our survival for longer, and they're more tried and tested, which makes them more efficient. And so for our day-to-day, we tend to rely more on those so-called older parts of the brain than we do the newer ones, which take more energy. You know, it takes a lot more energy to power the human brain. If you imagine being at work all day, you probably wouldn't then be in a position to go home and write a report because it would take mental energy. But you could do something emotional and intuitive, like watch Love is Blind, which I'll look forward to doing later. So for most of our day-to-day kind of decisions, it's that emotional brain. So typically, the emotional brain tends to take precedence over the rational brain because it's more efficient and it's been ensured our survival for longer. Fun example of this, hopefully it wasn't just me, but when I was a child, I was told the reason you automatically blink when you sneeze is because there's so much pressure in your head that if you were to keep your eyes open, your eyeballs would pop out of your skull. And obviously, as a young boy, I tried to see if I could keep my eyes open, see if it was true, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't rationally, consciously keep my eyes open any more than you could really concentrate and stop your heart from beating. So often that emotional brain, that instinctive brain, tends to take precedence over the rational one. And that's true even when you think we'd be rational, like in business, as we'll see later, but also here's an example from finance. This study found the worse the stock market was doing, the less likely people were to log into an investment app, which is probably not rational, because that's probably when you should take action, even if that action is snapping up stocks when they're cheap. What people were doing was exhibiting what's called the ostrich effect, putting their head in the sand and not wanting to face up to bad news. Or a great example as well is Aflac, which is an insurance company, where the CEO credits the company's success to a talking duck they had in their adverts. So insurance, it's a serious business, and a lot of kind of serious brands are quite resistant to using these kind of distinctive assets. But it worked really well because it was different, it was attention grabbing, it was memorable, and all of that served to put Aflac front and center in people's minds, and it was very good for the business. So as I mentioned, these principles apply even, or perhaps especially, in business. It's when things are high stakes, you're dealing with people. Yes, it can be more considered, but these biases are still there. I mean, if you think about buying a house as a similar analogy, you might put a lot of thought into it, have a careful list, but at the end of the day, you'll just pick the house that feels right in your guts, and it's very similar in business as well. And there's all sorts of examples of these biases and irrationality playing out in the business world, like Gerard Ratner, for example, who said his products were total crap, and that tanked the company. It wasn't a very rational thing to do. Or a case study that I love is Tropicana. A decade or so ago, they changed their branding, their packaging to this after lots of focus groups and research and brainstorming and so on. And in a way, it's very clever. It's nice and it's cute. I mean, the lid is in the shape of an orange. So when you open the lid, it feels like you're squeezing an orange implicitly. So it's cool, but it didn't have Tropicana branding on it. So people couldn't find it when they were distracted and rushed looking for orange juice. So they just bought something else instead. It cost them tens of millions of dollars, and they had to quickly change back to the old branding. So they potentially weren't being particularly rational when they thought to change the packaging. And you see this a lot in business, the pro-innovation bias, this feeling that you just have to do something. You can't just kind of sit on your laurels. You always have to be acting and innovating, which may not always be rational. And you may have heard of the long and the short of it by Binet and Field, where they looked at what predicts marketing campaign effectiveness, essentially finding that irrational and emotional drivers are more important than more rational ones. For example, campaigns which focus on increasing awareness, so being memorable and attention grabbing, that kind of Aflac duck type approach, those tend to be more effective in terms of generating big business effects. But interestingly, they found this is just as true for B2B campaigns as it is for B2C. So it might be a business context, but you're still dealing with people at the end of the day, and these psychological principles still hold. So we have this kind of paradox where people, even or especially in business, are irrational and biased and don't have a huge amount of brain power to think decisions through. And yet there's a huge amount of choice, complexity, and information to deal with in the business world. So how do we cope with all of this information and choice, but limited cognitive ability to do so? Well, let me ask you a question. Imagine you're on a business trip for one night in a foreign city, and you can only find these two places to eat. Where would you rather eat? So just in the chat, can you say either top or bottom? For the top restaurant or the bottom restaurant? It's pretty unanimous and quick there in people saying the top restaurant, because of course it's busy. And so if it's busy, it must be good. And that's what's called a heuristic, or a mental shortcut, a rule of thumb. If it's busy, it must be good. And that's generally correct. I mean, obviously, I'm sure we can all think of examples of things that were popular but not good. But by and by, if we follow busy equals good, it rarely steers us wrong. So these are the shortcuts that we use to navigate this world of complexity and information without having to think in a huge amount of depth. Now, usually one or two people pick the bottom one. I would probably pick the bottom one because I'm a disagreeable introvert. I'd rather not be around people, probably, especially that many people. But this is a point we'll come back to later, that not every nudge works the same for everyone. So it's important to understand exactly who you're talking to. But the main point here is there are these subconscious shortcuts that can influence choice. And if you understand them, if you have a handle on them, you can craft user experiences and pitches and sales decks and messaging that's super effective because it's tapping into these biases. Here's an example from the COVID vaccine campaign. Very skillful, masterful example. In just 19 words, they managed to pack at least 6 nudges. Those 19 words being, you have reached the top of the queue and are a priority for getting a free NHS COVID vaccine. So by saying there's a queue, they're using a nudge called social proof. If it's busy, it must be good. By having you reached the top of the queue, they're using commitment, where you feel invested, like you don't want to lose your place in the queue, like you've been waiting in line. Having you at the top and calling you a priority might be an appeal to ego to make you feel kind of special and important. Also saying that you're a priority is using scarcity to imply that demand is bigger than supply, so you feel the urgency to go and get it. Giving it for free is all about making it easy, reducing any perceived barriers like cost, but also maybe reciprocity, where you feel like you're being given something, so you feel obliged to return a favor. And then having it come from the NHS is using messenger effects, where we'll do something for people we like or trust. So I'm sure you can imagine how these kind of nudges can play out in business messaging too. And we like to say wherever there's behavior to change, we behavioral scientists can help, including B2B, of course. So again, we're dealing with people at the end of the day, so these nudges equally apply. And there's a few areas that this can apply to. For the first one, I'd like to show you this and ask you which square is darker. So just in the chat, say, would you say A or B is darker? Yeah, so most people saying A. But one person said they're the same, and I'm sure probably most and all of you have guessed that they are the same. And I'll just prove that here by covering everything else up. You can see they're the same. I'll take it away again. A looks darker than B, but they are actually the same. And there's two things that are important here. The first is that even if you're aware of biases and nudges, they still influence you like an optical illusion. So you know that A and B are the same shade. You know that rationally, consciously, and yet A still looks darker than B. So you can't unsee an optical illusion in the same way you can't not really be influenced by nudges. I know, for example, that Apple at least used to deliberately make too few units to meet demand, and that would cause scarcity, and people would queue up outside Apple stores to buy them, which was a social proof queue. They use all of these nudges. I know that, I'm aware of it, and yet I do still want the latest iPhone. It does still influence me. So you can't unsee these biases. And even in a business context, as we are now, we're doing a business presentation, and you're business people, and yet you're still influenced by this, right? But the second thing is useful for pricing, which is the implication that we don't make judgments in a vacuum. We don't make absolute judgments. So when I ask you which square is darker, you're not making that judgment in absolute terms. You're making it relative to other information. So you're judging, for example, the B square relative to the others around it, as well as the shadow coming from the cylinder. And that's what makes it look lighter, partly because it's surrounded by darker squares, so it looks lighter by contrast. And the same is true of prices, that if something is surrounded by more expensive prices, it seems cheaper by comparison. This might be why Rolls-Royce sometimes sell their cars at yachting conventions, because next to a multi-million-pound yacht, it looks like quite a bargain. This study found that people would pay more for CDs when there was a more expensive T-shirt on sale. Even though the T-shirt had nothing to do with the CDs, it acted as an anchor and bias people's perceptions of what they should pay. So when you're dealing with prices, that's just one technique you can use, is to frame it in relative terms. Compared to a competitor could be an obvious example. You could give people a discounted rate. So, you know, it's usually 10K, now it's 8K, whatever it might be. There's also famously the decoy effect. If you can give people choices, that works for two reasons. One, because you're activating a which to buy mindset rather than a whether to buy mindset. So instead of people thinking, should I buy them or not, they're thinking, which one should I buy? A bit like if a waiter asks you if you want still or sparkling, you still end up buying water. But also because you can introduce decoys to the choice set, which make some look more attractive than others. So if you have two products, people tend to choose the cheaper one. If you introduce a third, even more expensive one, people will then choose the middle one, which used to be the most expensive one, but now it looks more reasonable by comparison. So when you're in business presenting choices, options to clients, you can use these kind of techniques. There are also things you can do in terms of number psychology. For example, we tend to perceive that precise numbers are smaller than rounded numbers. So try not to have lots of zeros in the number, because people just psychologically associate it with being bigger. Removing the decimals, or in some way making the price smaller. Some research has even shown putting it in a smaller font, for example. But if you can make it physically smaller, that will make it feel smaller as a price as well. And also some research has pointed to removing the currency sign from prices, because it makes it feel less like money, so there's less pain of paying. You see this particularly in restaurants. But a caveat, I did try this with a client who was a supplements brand recently, and it had the opposite effect. So always test things, but I think the issue there is supplements, people are quite cynical anyway. So if you start to try being sneaky with prices, it might put people off. But generally, this seems to work. But the point here is you can frame and present the price in certain ways. So that's just one example of how you can use these nudges in business. But I want to talk more broadly now about changing people's behavior. So how do you get people to adopt you as a new supplier, for example? How do you get them to adopt a new technology or innovation? Now, last year, I co-published a book, which was a Sunday Times bestseller, and that is a nudge. And the book was about brainwashing, basically, and I joined some cults, and I did a year of research on totalitarian regimes and so on. But from a practical perspective, what I learned is, how do you change people's thinking and behavior drastically from one thing to another? And there are 7 principles that I'd like to share with you now that you can use in business, essentially, to get buy-in, especially on something that might be tricky, where there might be inertia or resistance. So the first rule I want to talk about is autonomy. And the principle here is that you can't push a donkey from behind. And if you try and force people to do something, they might do the opposite just to spite you. It's called reactance. It's why, you know, you can't just tell a teenager they're not allowed to smoke, because then they'll probably just go out and smoke a lot. So you always need to be fostering a sense of autonomy. There's a couple of ways you can do that. First of all is, again, by giving people a choice set, like the waiter with still or sparkling. Then they feel like it's their choice, they're having autonomy, but ultimately they're making a choice that benefits you either way. The second way you can foster autonomy is with the but you are free technique, where a meta-analysis found that if you begin a request with something like, you'll probably say no, but, or if you end it with something similarly like, well, it's up to you, people are about twice as likely to comply on average, because they have that feeling of autonomy. So in business, always make sure people don't feel like they're being forced into something, and that is their choice. Disrupt and reframe, partly sometimes referred to as the Alice in Wonderland technique, especially in interrogations, hence the picture. But this is about kind of bamboozling people a little bit, or grabbing them by the lapels and giving them a metaphorical slap. So the disrupt and reframe technique in consumer or experimental psychology bamboozles people a little bit and then presents a persuasive statement, and people are more likely to accept it if they're a bit confused, because they're not quite thinking, they're not quite analyzing it critically. So a famous study found that if you say, these cards cost 300 pennies, it's a bargain, people are more likely to buy that, because they're confused by the 300 pennies statement, and then the "it's a bargain" statement just kind of seeps in. On like a much wider scale, people are more likely to join, for example, multi-level marketing schemes if they are, I don't know, a military spouse that was moving from place to place, or if they've just gone through a divorce or something. But from a practical point of view, it's about surprising people. It's about cutting through, disrupting, maybe using loss aversion, showing them how what they're currently doing, their current setup is hurting them, or they're losing out from it. You really just need to grab their attention and give them, as I say, a metaphorical slap in order to get them to do something new. Then the new behavior needs to be as easy as possible. And part of that is doing things in increments, going in small steps, breaking the ask down into smaller things. So can you, for example, do a pilot or a trial, or there's certain trading apps where you can simulate what it would be like to trade on the app. And that's a foot in the door to get you then to use it properly. Car dealerships are quite good at this. One of the reasons they ask you to do a test drive is because buying a car is a big investment, right? It's quite scary. Going for a test drive is not. There's no obligation. It's easy to do. But once you've done that foot in the door, you're more likely to follow through and actually buy it. So ultimately, you need to take people through the lobby before you show them the penthouse. Norms, we've talked about social proof. This is really just showing that other people have led the way, and so therefore there's less risk. In animal psychology, there's a trap called the Larsen trap, which is used to trap pest birds. And normally the birds won't go in the cage because they're quite skeptical, especially crows. But the thing about the Larsen trap is it has a bird that lives in the cage. It's got water and food. And so other birds see that and they go, oh, it must be fine. It must be safe. And they go into the cage and get trapped. In a similar way, obviously you don't trap people. Maybe it's a bad example. But if you can show that other people have done something first, other people are doing it, people are more likely to feel safe with it. So are there case studies that you can use, real life case studies? Obviously endorsements and testimonials are great, but it's all about fostering that feeling that other people are doing this. It's also really key to work out what is the motivation for the person you're talking to, for your prospect. What is, so to speak, the piece of cheese on the mousetrap that's going to lure them in? What are their wishes? And these might be functional. Obviously, everyone in business wants to do things quicker and cheaper with better results. Of course, those functional things are important, but also it's really, really key to think about the emotional drivers. So the word motivation, it actually shares the same root as the word emotion and the word movement or motion. So emotion, motivation, motion, they're all kind of mean the same thing, which is about moving. So what's the emotion that's going to motivate people into movement? It might be maybe they're scared of being sacked, fair enough, or it might be wanting to win a prize and have that feeling of pride and status and recognition at work. Then co-creation is about getting investment, making people feel part of the process. They're more likely then to go along with it. In psychology, there's something called the IKEA effect, where people value furniture more if they assembled it themselves than if they were just given it pre-assembled. So how can you give people kind of a Lego kit of choices to assemble a solution from? And finally, even in business, make sure to keep it simple. Keep the language short. Use visual words. A great, if depressing example is that politicians will always have more success talking about building a wall, for example, than they would actually outlining a complex policy, because a wall is visual. It's literally concrete. So using that kind of language, metaphor, simple words, short, simple words, is much more persuasive, even in a business context. The only caveat I would say is you can sprinkle in technical language, A, to give them kind of authoritative tone, some authoritative spice, and B, because people who are experts in your category will want to see that you are also. So sprinkling jargon and technical language here and there is useful, but on the whole, keep it short and simple. So these principles I've built into an overall model I call disrupt, reframe, maintain. So first of all, you kind of need to shake people up a bit. Then you ease them into the new behavior and you draw them in based on their emotional kind of wishes. And then finally, you maintain by reinforcing behaviors, for example, having a community, having good service, etc. A much more simplified model is trigger, motive, and ability. So if you think about driving a car, first of all, you need to put the key in the engine and turn it. So there needs to be an initial trigger or spark. Second of all, there needs to be petrol in the engine. And so that's all about the emotion, which is going to drive people forward to do the behavior. And thirdly, there needs to be a clear road, smooth and free of obstacles, which people can drive along. And that's about making it as simple as possible to do the behavior. So trigger it, make sure there's a reason for them to do it, clear what's in it for me, and make sure it's as easy as possible to do. That's really the three most important things. Now, I'd just like to take you through a couple of examples from our back catalogue of applying kind of behavioral science thinking in a B2B context. One was for a DSP client, and one of the really key things we found from talking to their customers and prospects is about talking about outcomes, the what's in it for me, the emotional motivation, much more than the processes. So if you go to McDonald's, they have really advanced technical high-tech grills in the kitchen, but you don't care about that. McDonald's never talk about that. All you care about is the tastiness of the burger that you buy. And in the same way, when you're dealing with clients and advertising your services, it's really important to focus on the what's in it for me. What will people get out of this? And again, yes, the functional things, it's cheaper, it's faster, it gets better results, are all good. But also, what are the emotional things? Like, is it a feeling of control? Is it a feeling of being smarter than the competition or your colleagues? Is it a feeling of not being ripped off by other companies? What's the emotional driver? We also use reframing on their competitors' strengths. So anything that is a strength of a company or a person can be flipped into its shadow, which is a weakness. So if somebody is like strong and dominant, you can say that they're rigid and domineering. If somebody's fun and has a laugh, you can say that they're not serious. So strengths can be flipped into negatives and vice versa. So, for example, Google, the common thing that we came up against talking to customers and prospects is you won't get fired for choosing Google. So how do we reframe that? Well, we say you won't get promoted for choosing Google. Another example from our back catalogue is a market maker, which is a kind of small niche investment type firm. And they were competing with big banks for the attentions of asset managers. Those asset managers are very busy. They have lots of companies who want to win them over. They're under a lot of stress, possibly burned out. And so it's very hard for this company that we worked with to secure meetings with them and to convert them into qualified leads and into clients. But really that key was, how do we get that first meeting? Because they keep ignoring us or saying they're too busy. And so there are various things we recommended, but mostly it was all about making it as easy as possible for them because they're very busy. So first of all, in terms of tone of voice, of how they talk to these asset managers, some of the recommendations we had were about being more casual, sending fewer messages. It's a bit like dating, you don't send 3 messages in a row, just send one, wait a few days between them, etc. Write in lowercase, write less text, and so on. Use that but you are free technique. So say, you'll probably say no, but ... Avoid ironic processes. So what I often saw with this client is that they were saying to these asset managers, oh, I've been trying to talk to you for a few months now, I've not been able to reach you. That's actually counterproductive because it's reminding them of the status quo. It's reminding them that they're not responding, and so they're just going to keep not responding. Fluency also, how to make meeting requests easy. Tell them when and where to meet rather than asking them to choose or to come up with something. So make it as simple and as thoughtless as possible to meet you. Make sure there's a simple, clear call to action in each message. Don't overwhelm people. Do something that sounds like it's a lot of effort on anybody's part. So I would see, for example, the client would say, oh, I'd like to come to Frankfurt to meet you. Well, that sounds like a big deal. So is there a more casual thing you can say? And a really crucial one, probably the most effective one, is something called future discounting, where the client was typically asking, can we meet next week? And they were being ignored or getting no's. But future discounting speaks to the fact that we feel stuff in the future to be less real than stuff in the present. So the further out in the future it is, the less real it feels. So if you ask, instead of meeting next week, if you ask, can we meet in 3 months' time? People are much more likely to say yes to that because it's like, oh, it's 3 months away, whatever, yeah. And then by the time it rolls around, they're committed, they're more likely to turn up. And so this really revolutionized the client's pipeline. They're getting a lot more meetings now. And then finally, in the past, we did a review of 16 B2B case studies and found some key psychological principles of how to be successful. So, of course, in B2B, relationships are very important, and those kind of person-centered nudges are likewise quite effective, like self-disclosure, where you disclose something personal about yourself to build relationships, and of course, being courteous. However, you're still branding two people, and so being memorable through distinctive assets like the Aflac duck, tapping into emotional motivations, as we've talked about, and building for long-term memory rather than purely or perhaps at all short-term activation metrics is more effective. If you want to build an emotional B2B campaign, there are some common themes, such as humanity in a tech-obsessed world, your partner in a tough world, we know it's lonely at the top, feeling secure of your choice, championing an entrepreneur, and fear of missing out. So those are common themes. So picking one of those would not be a bad place to start. Concrete and usable information is really important. Make sure it's simple, easy to understand, short, and really, really communicate the benefits. Talk about the what's in it for me, for your target audience. In particular, focus on a key, easily understood strength to differentiate the brand from a sea of corporate sameness. So there's a famous psychological book called The Crowd from over 100 years ago now, but it's about crowd psychology. And he said that to persuade people, it's not really about engaging them rationally, but it's about making a bold statement and just repeating it constantly until it holds. So likewise, what's your one key message? Make it emotional and simple and just keep saying it. Customers are typically not interested in the product or the process itself, the technical specifics that we in the company care about a lot. The customer usually doesn't. They're much more interested in a solution to their problems. And that solution, often it's better to be a painkiller than a supplement. So what's the problem that you're solving? What's the pain you're relieving rather than what's the gain you're giving to people? It's more about solving pain than it is about bringing new benefits, typically. So the final thing that I just want to touch upon is, as we alluded to earlier, these are not always one size fits all. So nudges that work for some people won't necessarily work for others. For example, this study sent out letters advertising loans in South Africa, sent out 50,000 letters, and they varied things between letters to see how it impacted loan uptake. For example, having a simpler table, as you can see on the right compared to the left, that increased loan uptake significantly. But interestingly, having a picture of a smiling woman increased uptake, but only among men. So it's a nudge, in this case, liking, that worked, but only for a particular target group. So it's really important to know who you're dealing with in order to use the right kind of persuasive strategy. Now you can read your clients and prospects from data footprints. A little harder to do in B2B, but not impossible. But for example, in B2C, you can read people psychologically from their financial transactions, where conscientious, organized people spend more money on savings, whereas disorganized people spend more money on snacks or taking cash out. Or agreeable people spend more money on donations, while disagreeable people spend more money on legal fees and investments, for example. And these can, in theory, be quite accurate, these models. Then you take those insights from the data and use them to craft messaging or pitches or propositions that really resonate psychologically with the target audience, right down to things like aesthetics, where, for example, a more organized segment would respond better to aesthetics which are symmetrical and predictable and conventional. Whereas if they're really typified by high extroversion, the aesthetics would work better if they're quite bright and aesthetically diverse. And this applies to B2B equally as it does to B2C. There are different groups within the people that you're talking to or hoping to talk to. So for a previous project for a financial services company, we found that their clients and prospects went into basically 4 buckets. For example, there's a risk-focused kind of dinosaur bucket where they're quite slow, quite risk averse. They want a solution which will reduce risk and liability. So if you're talking to them, it's all about using familiar, conventional, careful language and nudging them through loss aversion. So making them feel like they miss out if they don't work with you. It's a risk not to work with you. Whereas, for example, the more agility focused companies, these are more like agile startups. They were more likely to be sold on short language, a very simplified proposition, nudging them through fluency, so using kind of concrete metaphors, that kind of thing. Ultimately, this tends to be more effective, these personality targeted messages and pitches, with one study found in a B2C context that personality targeted Facebook ads has had up to 50% higher conversion rates. But in a kind of B2B context from our own back catalogue, this was selling utilities insurance to homeowners and landlords. We did a psychological segmentation of that customer base. One of the segments, for example, called Aspirational Annie, they're quite creative and urbane. And so for them, we created messaging which was quite thoughtful and different and artistic compared to, say, Nervous Nancy, who was more organized and neurotic. And for them, the messaging was more about simplicity and loss aversion. But the end result was cost per acquisition being up to $30 lower than what they were doing previously. But that ultimately is how you put brains into business. So I hope that was useful, and I think we have some time for questions, comments, etc.
Nice one. Thanks, Patrick. This is so interesting. I can't wait to try some of these things in some of our campaigns for our clients. So wondering if we've got some questions on the Q&A. Thanks for the presentation. In B2B, particularly large ones, decisions are mostly made in a group or in hierarchy of different positions. Do these nudges still work to influence the decisions in groups, says Seema?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, well, they certainly work. I see what you're saying, that it's more complex when there's a group involved. But group decision making is still influenced to biases, like, of course, conformity, the loudest opinion in the room being the most influential, that kind of thing. So yeah, maybe it requires a bit more thought to understanding the group dynamics, but the nudges do definitely still work.
Nice. We've got another one on the chat from Fabian Tyler. He's asking, what input data do you use?
Well, 3 sources, usually a mix of multiple, but the first is kind of primary data. So we do, for example, do psychological qualitative research with customers and prospects of a client in order to get under their skin and understand motivations and so on. But particularly as well, we do quantitative surveys to get that data. Secondly, there's the user data that you might have, client transaction data, or you might have, I don't know, postcodes, date of births, whatever data you do have. And then maybe, possibly, we can use the primary data to build a model for all of the data. So very basic example, let's say you're a pet shop and you send out a psychological survey and 1% of your customers fill it in. But from that 1%, you can see, for instance, people who buy tarantulas at 3 a.m. are highly impulsive. And then you can make a model that says everyone in the database who buys tarantulas at 3 a.m. Are impulsive. And then thirdly, there's like third-party data, the kind of Experian type stuff, which is a bit noisy, but it can be useful for enriching the data. So then you could like scrape LinkedIn profiles, you could scrape client websites. There are also ways to kind of passively get data on prospects, and then build models on top of that.
Nice. I hope that answered the questions. We've got a really nice comment saying that it was a brilliant session, thought-provoking information to reflect on your notes. Thanks, Andy. We've got Matt asking, have you ever applied this approach in a bidding context?
Only in the sense that I guess all customers and clients are bidding in one way on something, but I don't think so. Dan, can you think of anything?
I tend to agree with you, Patrick. I think, you know, in fast decisions, this tends to happen anyway. I think you can use a lot of the nudges that Patrick was talking about in the micro transactions and moments of bidding, either getting someone to put an opening bid, how you frame that so they put the bid in quickly, how you encourage them to keep spending it up. You can use these here.
Nice one. Any more questions from the group? Paula needs to dash, but thanks, really interesting. Very informative sessions, all the good stuff for you guys, fascinating. Okay, I think we don't have any more questions. We're 7 minutes to go. So, oh, I noticed you use some of these. I noticed you use some of these techniques in the invitation. Thanks for a great session. That's a good spot. That is definitely a good spot. You briefly glanced over joining cults as research. So briefly that I questioned if I misheard. Is that true? What's one takeaway you saw in cults about building belief within a community? Sorry, I couldn't let the cult mention slide.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I did. I joined a couple of cults as book research. I mean, I could talk about it for hours. I mean, one of the things that's very interesting is incrementalism. So I can't really say who the cult was because they're very litigious, but you can probably read between the lines. They don't start off by saying immediately, give me your life savings, but so at first they're like, come for one meeting. And then at that meeting, they're like, sign up and come every Saturday. And then they try and get the hours up and up and up. So they're using that foot in the door, the incrementalism technique. So I don't think people just like join cults one day. It's more of kind of a slow ramping up of commitment. That's just one thing. There are many others I could talk about.
Maybe a different webinar for that.
Yeah.
We've got one more question from Ewan. With the 7 principles for changing behavior, is it important to try to tap into all of these or a select few depending on the context? For example, we have a lot of wealth managers, fintech clients who sell innovative and disruptive technologies that may not have huge amounts of social proof or other people leading the way. In this case, would it be better to focus on the other principles more?
I think in general, that overall model of first kind of grabbing people and shaking them up a bit, then drawing them in and making it easy. Generally that applies, but the flavor, of course, will be different depending on who you're talking to. So social proof might not always be appropriate because, you know, you might be dealing with very cynical people. Yeah, I mean, wealth managers, fintech, not to generalize too much, but they're probably quite more disagreeable than average, right? And less likely to go along with the crowd. However, you could kind of frame it as fear of missing out or the bandwagon effect. So if you have your user base has gone from 1 people to 3 people, that's an increase of 200%. So it's about the way that you frame the number to make it feel like, okay, this is something exciting that you need to get on board with.
Thanks for that. Any others? I'm jumping between the chat and the Q&A. We've got questions on. Got another one from Nahom. You mentioned that one of the most important things is to continue showing your key message. Do you have any data on how frequently the end user should see this for it to make an impact? I'm reading.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, from from kind of consumer research, probably it's the same. There's no kind of upper limit, and even if people find it annoying, they still remember it and they'll still buy it. So there's research that's very clear on that even annoying repetitive adverts work quite well. You may remember, for example, the Go Compare adverts in the UK. Very, very annoying, repeated in every ad break, but they're very effective. Or in the UK, we have these Domino's ads that are really annoying and they're in every break, but they're probably very effective. So there's no upper limit. So it's just as much as you possibly can, I think.
Just to build on that, also in a lot of B2B contexts, it's not like audiences are ready to buy right away. So that repetitive nature of getting it into the brain so that when they are, it comes to mind first of all is pretty important.
Yeah. Now, and I think there's some like social media benchmarks, for example, on what is the frequency that you need to get for an ad to be like remembered and stuff. And I think it's a minimum of 4 at least, right? So thanks, Nahum, for that question. We've got Anna Bonilla. How original a campaign can be these days with the inclusion of AI copywriting? Oh, does AI know about nudges?
Well, it does, and it can be quite a scarily good psychologist sometimes. But I think I don't really like AI, I guess, in principle, but I do think it can be a very useful tool. So it doesn't have to replace creativity, but I think it can augment it, that you can ask it for some creative ideas and it will then give you those ideas and then you can run with them and develop them. That's how I use it, at least.
Nice one. Another one from Chris Griggs. Do you see much this is a really good question. Do you see much variance in international regional motivations?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, there's a lot of difference between regions. Even personality differs by region. Like people in London, on average, are more creative but less friendly, believe it or not. I mean, of course, not everyone in London is like that, but on average, there are regional differences. So that's why we do these kind of segmentations, is to understand what are these clusters of people and how do you talk to them.
Really good. We've got 2 minutes. If there are any other last minute questions. Doesn't look like it. So that shows how good your presentation has been, guys. I think if we don't have any others, I think we can leave it there. So we'll close up, send the recording to everyone. You'll be able to reach either Patrick, Dan, or myself through email. Check our website, check their content. It's really good. And yeah, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.